What's going on, guys? So I am out here at Ron Hoover RV and Marine in Corpus Christi, Texas for a very different video. This video is going to touch on some of the things that people generally ask whenever it comes to new RV construction. And that is, what could they have done better and how could all those small things have impacted the price had they done it? Is it worth paying the extra amount? And for reference, we're going to use this really cool 2021 Alliance Paradigm 390 MP. This is their mid-bunk multi-purpose center room unit that really appeals to me. So we're going to use this as an example. Hang tight, I'll be right back. All right, we're gonna look at the inside and the outside, but just so you all know, I already did a full review on one of these, so just do a YouTube search for 390 MP and Big Truck Big RV and it will probably pull it up. But the focus of this video is to take a look at some of the things that they could have done maybe a little different. So let's focus in on that. So right off the bat, the reason why I'm choosing Alliance is because Alliance is a very consumer-oriented company in terms of taking their buyers' feedback, or at least potential buyers' feedback, and really applying them to a unit that is customer focused, right? That is very much, this is what our customers wanted, so we tried to fit all of that into a package that they could afford. But you take a unit like this, it's going to have an MSRP of about $96,000 to $100,000 depending on how you get it equipped. Sales price on something like this is typically going to be in the mid to high 70s. Generally, it might fluctuate here and there depending on price of lumber and all the other different things that are kind of changing how our marketplace works these days. But what I wanted to do was just go through and give you examples of areas where they could have done things different and how that could have impacted the price. So let's start up front. If we look at the LCI Rotaflex pin box, this pin box right here is about a $500 component if you buy it aftermarket. Of course, when it's spec'd into the frame and you're getting an LCI frame with LCI landing gear, with LCI suspension and, you know, LCI pin box, there's a discount. But let's just say they opted to go with something like a Reese Goose Box. Well, a Reese Goose Box is roughly a $1,200 to $1,500 item. So there are no agreements in place for LCI to specifically use Reese products. So it would have to be a purchase done by the manufacturer of the RV, and they would have to add it. Basically, they'd order the frame with either a basic pin box or with no pin box at all. They generally do it with the basic pin box simply because it gives them the ability to move it around the lot. But this pin box right here would be, again, about a $500 pin box. Now, the Reese Goose Box isn't designed yet for this new Rhino frame, so you would have to actually go with something like a Gen Y Executive, which is about a $1,500 pin box. So you're talking, let's just say on the wholesale side, about $800 worth of upgrades in just the pin box. So if you take this, let's say it's a $75,000 RV, and let's bump it up to about $1,000 total, you're adding about $1,000 to upgrade the pin box. And that's when you're removing this one, of course. Coming around, baggage doors, things like that, I think are pretty good. Now, if you went with like a water manifold system in here, a lot of people realize that, you know, the best water system you can put in an RV is a manifold system where everything comes to the central hub and you can control each valve independently. Some brands do that. DRV uses like a full residential style copper manifold, whereas you look at like Riverstone, it's more of a plastic manifold. They're both really good systems. But the cost of materials, the cost of the manifold itself, let's just say that the manifold itself would be about $400, maybe $300 to $400 for the equipment. Well, the additional time it would take to actually make all your connections to it to run it that way instead of doing it the way they normally do it here would probably add an additional hour or two in terms of actual manufacturing of the unit, which it's not just this unit that adds an hour or two. It adds it to every single unit plus the delay in production. So just keep that in mind. And let's just say that probably equates to an additional $1,000. Right, so now we're $2,000 up. I'll try to round all the numbers up for easy math. So now we're up to what, $77,000. Now, the piece that they do here good at Alliance is they put individual valves on pretty much all your lines. So similar to a manifold system, if you have a water issue, you can shut a valve off at that specific connection and mitigate damaging the rest of the RV or losing water to the entire RV. But that's one area. Now, let's say that the next area is your sidewall, right? So Alliance uses your traditional 2-inch thick sidewall, whereas if you look at DRV, Lux, Riverstone, they use a 3 or 3¼ inch thick sidewall with like a batten hung style insulation. So from a material perspective, the foam insulation actually costs more than the batten insulation, but the thickness of the wall requires thicker studs going through the wall. And because of that, that drives the cost up. Now, something else that like a DRV does a little different is they double up the Luan backer behind the fiberglass gel coat. Now, what I like about Alliance and some of these is they use Azdel as opposed to your traditional Luan backer, but it's thinner, so you don't get quite the noise killing capability, noise canceling. You don't have quite the R value because you don't have as thick of a material. But arguably, sidewall technology is one of those things that the foam insulation, laminated sidewall, Azdel has come so far. It's such a good product that I don't know if it's a huge advantage to go to a 3-inch thick sidewall, to be honest. And believe it or not, you lose 2 inches of interior width because that space has to come off of somewhere. But let's just say that they decided to go to a 3-inch thick sidewall with foam insulation. That would likely add about $3,000 to $4,000 to the sidewalls whenever they're producing them. So now you're up to about $80,000 if you wanted to go to that. And again, I'm only focusing on areas that you might actually look at a video and go, man, I really wish they had done this better. Now, let's say you're going to go with like a Truma on-demand water system. Those systems are about $1,000 on top of the cost of your traditional water heater. So you can basically say you're at about $81,000 now. Coming under here, here's the big place we're going to spend some money. So if you look at the axles on this coach, it has 7,000 pound axles. They run Sterling G-rated tires, but they're a slightly higher load rated tire. Sterling is a division of Westlake, and they basically made this tire as kind of an upgrade to their traditional Westlake G-rated tires. Now it's kind of funny because the folks over at Coachman actually started that collaboration with Sterling, or with Westlake, to create this tire, and a lot of manufacturers have kind of jumped on board to use it because it's a good tire. Now, when you look at what a lot of people would say, what's a better setup, they would recommend either 3 axles or twin 8,000 pound axles, 17.5 or even 19.5 inch wheels and tires, and a higher rated US manufactured tire. So if they added another axle, typically it's going to be a Dexter or an LCI axle. They would also have to modify the frame to be able to support it, and anything that could be blocking it in its path. Like you simply couldn't add an axle here and you simply couldn't add one there without modifying the frame. But if you were going to do that plus all the components that tie it into the frame, you're looking, just by adding an axle with the wheels, tires, and everything, you're probably adding about $3,000 worth of additional components. Now, let's step it up and say we're moving to better tires, better wheels with disc brakes. That entire setup and that type of configuration would likely add about $7,000 to $10,000 total in terms of all the hardware, all the components you would need to make that upgrade. So this by far is the most expensive. And if you're looking at an independent suspension setup where you aren't using leaf springs anymore, you're using like a torsion axle or rubber axle instead, basically a independent setup, you are going to be adding probably an additional $2,000 to $3,000 on top of that just for the components. And depending on the system, you would have to add frame reinforcements to be able to support that type of axle system. So let's just say you go with the very best of the best, 3 axles, name brand, high-end tires, wheels, brakes, upgraded axles, all of that. You know, some people even think that like a gooseneck style dually axle would perform better on an RV, but let's just say about $13,000 would give you a fully upgraded, much better, more robust system that I think most people would jump on board and say is the best system you can buy. So now we're roughly at about $95,000, $94,000 worth of equipment in this area. I'm fine with the rack and pinion slide. Let's go around. Now here's a big one. A lot of folks say the weakest link on an RV is the roof. And even though the folks at Alliance use a PVC roof versus a TPO, they're all relatively the same, right? It's a rubber membrane that stretches off over the top of the roof, and that's your roofing membrane. And a lot of folks say the best possible way to go would be either an aluminum roof or a full one-piece fiberglass roof, similar to like you might see on very high-end motor coaches. So that type of an upgrade is arguably the most expensive, and it can add the most weight very quickly. To do that, to set it up the way you would need, plus to have the factory to be able to build those components, would likely add about $6,000 to the cost on top of what you would normally pay for this roof. So overall cost would probably be closer to about $10,000, but let's just say $6,000 to $8,000 would be a rough estimate of if they put that on at the factory. So now we're about $105,000 roughly, just to add the roof here. So far we've done quite a bit, right? And it's definitely a more robust unit, but just with what we've done, we've likely added about $20,000 to the cost of the RV, $25,000 to the cost of the RV, as well as, I venture to say, an additional 6,000 pounds. So just keep that in mind. Now we're gonna step inside. Now we're inside, and there are all sorts of things that could be done differently. Let's say the biggest one, and this is one that people comment on all the time, why don't they use an automotive style wiring harness system in an RV? Alliance actually does a pretty good job. They color code all their wires. A lot of manufacturers do that, but I believe they actually give you a diagram. You can actually find a diagram of what color does what, which is something a lot of manufacturers don't do. But on this specific unit, let's say that they stripped out all the residential style wiring and they were able to make an automotive style harness that could actually pass code, and it would wire everything neatly through conduit, away from just hanging down. It's just, an incredibly neatly designed wiring system. And let's couple plumbing into that, right? So if you have a plumbing system that, again, is very, very neatly ran, let's just say typical to what you would see in like a commercial construction, commercial building where everything's neatly ran and it's fastened perfectly, you would be looking at an increase in labor and material costs for sure, but primarily the biggest hit would be in labor and time. So the time it adds, and that would slow down production tremendously. So let's say they produce 20 of these a month, this specific floor plan, this specific model. That would probably reduce that number to maybe like 5 or less, just because the amount of time it takes to do that would significantly add time, and that would impact the cost, of course, because they couldn't produce as many units, they wouldn't sell as many units, and the cost would have to be adjusted to reflect the improvements that they've made. And that would probably equal a good $5,000 or more in just development cost of an RV on the production line. So now we're looking at about $110,000 to implement that in place. When it comes to fit and finish, use of better fastening, use of better materials for things like that, nails and stuff like that, I really think that that's something they could do. I don't think that that would take a lot of cost. I think that they could easily monitor and control how that process is done a little better. Even slowing that down 5 minutes would probably equate to a much, much better product by all manufacturers at the end of the day. So using, better fasteners, using a better process, slow things down a little bit in that sense, even if they just add 5 to 10 minutes to each build just to make sure that it's all done properly, and then they inspect that part of it so trim doesn't fall down, issues like that don't occur. That's something that I think they should just do. I don't think that equates to much, so I'm not going to add that in. When it comes to certain areas of trim, you got to remember there's a lot of wood in an RV. There's very little wood in a car, a lot of wood in an RV. You could probably say 80% of an RV is lumber. So lumber fluctuates. And when I say fluctuates, I'm not talking about price. Well, I could be talking about price because it's insane right now, but I'm talking more about how humidity, how moisture in different parts of the country impact lumber in different ways. So oftentimes trim issues, things like that, are more of a climate environment thing and less of a attachment thing. But if you use better fasteners, if you secure it better, you mitigate and reduce the risk of those types of failures. Now, of course, another area could be things like your air conditioning systems. You could always add 3 ACs to all your units, put power management in place, upgrade to really, really nice units that don't use as much power. They start up more efficiently, things like that. Of course, I think most people know from an accessory or a component perspective, the air conditioning systems are probably some of the most expensive components you can add. I think for the most part, they do that pretty well. What they don't do well, in my opinion, and I think what Alliance has addressed very well, is they don't duct their air conditioning systems. even if you have a good system in terms of how it was designed from a ductwork perspective, you still have to have the employees that actually install it correctly. So there's not aluminum flashing and aluminum tape blocking and debris and stuff inside of the system. So slowing that process down, or at least providing better quality control, maybe better materials to prevent certain components from, or certain parts of the ducting from coming loose, I think is something that they could work on. I think that they should really just manufacture components that are more plug and play and don't require as much tape. I think that would probably work better. That way you just eliminate the need to take the environment into account. How does tape hold up in Elkhart, Indiana versus South Texas, you know, in the heat and humidity difference that you get? Now finally, and this one's kind of an easy one to talk about, it is overall fit, finish, final quality control, and inspection. There are absolutely improvements that can take place here, and I think most manufacturers should focus on constantly improving that process. Some of them are kind of hard to find. Like for instance, you know, the person who attached all this wood trimming right here may have not dialed their gun in properly. So you look at all this stuff and you're like, well, it looks really good. I'm inspecting it. I don't see any of it lifting off. It looks really, really well. All your joints, all your corners, everything looks good. But then you get this thing down to a dealership and you find that you had a joint split open because you don't actually have a nail there, right? Those little things, those can happen. Those are areas where the dealership will generally address those problems before you buy it. You might see the problem on the dealer lot, but then hopefully the dealer addresses that problem before you physically take ownership of that unit. Most of those problems will be addressed. Some of those problems can still linger because, again, this is really one of the few products out there besides a house that's going to be hand assembled, hand nailed, hand screwed, hand glued. It's not, you know, a robotic process. It's not a CAD driven process. You have a lot of people moving in and out of this unit that are doing a lot of different things, and a pre-delivery inspection can test for a lot of them, but it can't test for certain things. Like for instance, if the person that screwed this panel in over tightened that screw, you may never know at the factory. You may never know for 2 years until that screw just kind of pops out because there's wires back here pushing against it, right? So addressing things like that are absolutely important in the industry, but understanding that there's kind of a limited number of these things that you can address. You can look for errors. You can make sure that all your drawers open up properly and that they close properly. You can make sure that your handles aren't loose. You can make sure hinges aren't loose. You can make sure things work. But at the same time, though, there's certain things that you really can't tell, especially if it was covered up by the person doing it and it was just missed during PDI because there was no feasible way to inspect that thing, right? Some of the crimps on PEX lines, you can inspect them, they can look really good, but even a small deviance in how it was crimped might cause a plumbing issue later. So you always have to keep that in mind. And that can happen at a home as well with residential construction. But you know, at the end of the day, I think that there are some improvements. What it ends up doing is driving the price up, though, significantly. So a unit like this, which I would argue to say is a very well-built unit, it has a lot of really nice features to it, and it's set up well for what you're going to be using it for. If I wanted to add the robustness of the third axle, or if I wanted to upgrade all those components, if I wanted to add the thicker sidewalls with more foam insulation, all that, would I be willing to pay between $20,000 to $25,000 to $30,000 more than I can get this specific unit for today to have those, knowing that what's on here today is probably perfectly fine for the application it's being used on. Overkill is always great, and I'm a big fan of it, but at what point does it make it cost prohibitive when they can sell a unit like this and probably have roughly the same number of issues as one with all of those other upgrades if you don't control the quality control side of the house? And again, there's only so much you can do from a quality control perspective when you're dealing with stuff that's being, you know, hand nailed and hand screwed and hand adhered by people, right? That it's not robots that are doing it, that you can dial in and make micro adjustments to every little thing. Anyways, guys, I sure hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a comment below. This is a topic that's super important. It's one I touch on in a lot of videos, and I've had entire videos talking about, you know, the RV industry in general. But what are your opinions? What are things that you would be willing to pay more for? And, you know, just to make this interesting, how much more would you be willing to pay for individual things? right? So a third axle, better tires, better wheels, better brakes, those types of things. How much would you actually be willing to fork out to pay for those things, right? A lot of these really, really boutique brand fifth wheels that everyone references to and say, man, no one built it like Pilgrim, or no one built it like this specific brand that built it 15 years ago. Well, guess what? A lot of those brands are out of business because they didn't sell enough units to stay competitive. And you can build the best product in the world, but if you put yourself out of business doing it, well, then not many people are ever going to be able to experience it. So just keep that in mind. Guys, if you haven't had a chance, please take a moment, subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up, and we'll talk to you again very soon.